The gavel cracked like a gunshot as Judge Harlan sentenced a homeless veteran to jail, without knowing he'd just missed the only hearing that could have saved him from the streets. Her courtroom fell silent. Then the truth hit her like a punch to the chest. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The moment the gavel struck, a sharp crack echoed off the marble walls, bouncing down the rows of mostly vacant benches like a gunshot. Judge Harlan remained frozen for a beat, her hand still resting atop the polished wood handle, her eyes unreadable, but tight around the edges. Outside, the rain tapped steadily against the courthouse windows, a metronome to the silence now stretching across the room. Daniel Cross stood exactly where he had when the sentence was pronounced, as if rooted to the floor. His shoulders slumped slightly beneath a threadbare military surplus jacket, the edges frayed and darkened with age and street grime. His beard was patchy, salt overtaking pepper, and his sunken eyes stared not at the judge, nor at the bailiff who now began to approach, but somewhere just beyond the wood-paneled walls, perhaps to a memory, or maybe to nowhere at all. The public defender, a fresh-faced man named Elliot Rand, barely into his 30s and still clinging to the fragile hope that justice could be reasoned with, stepped forward again. "Your Honor," he began carefully, voice lowered but insistent. "With all due respect, Mr. Cross is a veteran, and he suffers from documented mental health issues, including chronic PTSD. He wasn't fleeing justice. He was surviving. He's been sleeping in an alley behind St. Michael's. They just closed the shelter on 7th Street last month. He didn't have a phone, a car, or a mailing address." Judge Harlan didn't look at him. Her eyes remained on Daniel, but her thoughts were somewhere else now, flickering behind a stoic mask like lightning behind storm clouds. She had heard it too late, that murmur Daniel had uttered after the gavel's blow. "I didn't have a phone. I never meant to miss it." Too quiet for the courtroom microphone. Not too quiet for her. A sharp intake of breath came from the back of the room, an older woman in a tweed coat clutching a weathered umbrella. No one paid her any mind. The bailiff, a heavy-set man with kind eyes and a badge that said S. Larkin, reached for Daniel's arm, but Daniel didn't resist. He didn't even move. His fingers twitched once at his side, like a flinch from some invisible threat. Judge Harlan shifted in her chair. That single sentence, barely audible, pressed against her ribs like something unfinished. It gnawed at the edges of her professional certainty. Contempt, she had said. It was the word she reserved for the indifferent, the belligerent. But Daniel hadn't been either. He had been lost. Still, the machinery of the courtroom moved forward. The bailiff placed a light hand on Daniel's elbow, and the man finally turned. Not to the judge, not to the attorney, but to the side, toward the tall stained-glass window behind the clerk's bench. It depicted Lady Justice, blindfolded, stoic, perfect. The light through it was gray and wan, diffused by the rain. "Do you know what it feels like?" Daniel said suddenly, his voice coarse but clear. "To sleep with your back against a wall because you're scared of shadows? To wake up and not know what day it is? I didn't miss court because I don't care. I missed court because I don't sleep." The room held its breath. Even the rain seemed quieter. Judge Harlan's pen, resting in her fingers, stilled. But the record had already been written. The gavel had come down. The system had moved. And yet, for a brief moment, something shifted, something intangible but palpable. A pause in the cold rhythm of justice, a fracture in the glass smoothness of order. Judge Harlan didn't speak again. She didn't soften, and she didn't retract. That would come later, or it wouldn't. But behind her eyes, the war had already begun, between the letter of the law and the brittle weight of humanity, between the woman she had trained herself to be and the woman, once, long ago, who might have seen the man, not just the case. As Daniel Cross was led from the courtroom, the door thudded shut behind him with a dull, final sound, but in Judge Harlan's mind, the gavel was still falling. Oh. The office was quiet, save for the ticking of an old brass clock perched above a shelf of legal encyclopedias no one had touched in years. The soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like a gnat in the silence. Judge Rebecca Harlan sat at her mahogany desk, surrounded by neat stacks of case files, but her eyes were locked on one folder. It was open, slightly crooked, its corners already soft from being handled too many times that night. Cross. Daniel R. Her fingers lingered on the paper inside, pressing against the worn texture, as if by touch she could absorb more of the man's story than the cold, bureaucratic ink could reveal. U.S. Army Sergeant, Bronze Star, 2 tours in Iraq. She reread those lines at least 3 times, not because she doubted them, but because they clashed so violently with the image still burned into her mind, that of a hollow-eyed man in a torn coat, standing in her courtroom with the weight of the world stitched into his posture. It was as if the 2 versions of Daniel Cross, war hero and homeless vagrant, had been filed under different realities. But no, they were the same man. She had just never looked close enough to see him. Scrolling further through the scanned documents and attachments, she reached the field report. Fallujah, 2007. His unit had hit a roadside IED, 2 killed, 3 wounded. Daniel had dragged one of the injured out of a burning vehicle with shrapnel embedded in his own leg. Temporary deafness, partial vision loss for weeks, and still he returned to duty until the symptoms of TBI and PTSD overtook his ability to function. There were no medals displayed in her office, no flags folded into neat triangles. But suddenly, the room felt unbearably full of ghosts. She turned to the housing records. There it was, application after application, pages upon pages of paperwork, denials stamped with clinical detachment, insufficient documentation, missing ID, no fixed mailing address, reapply in 90 days, over and over. The bureaucratic loop had trapped him like barbed wire. Without an address, he couldn't receive benefits, and without benefits, he couldn't secure an address. One document showed a missed intake meeting at the VA's downtown office. The note read, "Applicant failed to appear," but the record also showed it had been scheduled during the same week he was hospitalized for hypothermia. And then came the line that stopped her cold. VA housing appeal hearing scheduled for 11:15 a.m., April 10th. She stared at that date. April 10th. That was the same morning she'd held him in contempt. The same morning she had, with all the gravity of her office, sentenced him to 30 days behind bars for missing a date he never had a chance to keep. The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. By enforcing courtroom procedure to the letter, she had helped break a man already barely holding together. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, tangibly, legally. She had taken away his shot, not just at shelter, but at stability, at relief, at hope. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, but there was no comfort there. Her black judicial robe hung neatly on a hook behind her, but she suddenly felt naked, exposed, not to others, but to herself. Her whole career had been built on the foundation of structure, order, logic. She had prided herself on precision, believing that justice meant consistency. But what she had just read wasn't justice. It was arithmetic, cold, blind arithmetic that counted missed dates, but not broken lives. She closed the folder gently, as if afraid to harm it further, and set it aside with both reverence and shame. Her hands trembled as she reached for her tea, long gone cold. In the stillness of her office, something inside her cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but like a tiny hairline fracture in the base of a pillar that, given enough time, might shift the whole structure above it. She could not undo what had been done, but the truth was now laid bare before her, and the weight of it was hers to carry. The courtroom was unusually full for a Thursday morning. Word had spread, not through headlines or official channels, but in hushed conversations between clerks, murmurs in courthouse elevators, and shared texts among local veterans. Something was about to happen, and it wasn't on the docket. Judge Rebecca Harlan entered the chamber precisely at 9:00 a.m. As she always did, but today her posture betrayed something unfamiliar. There was still the steel of her authority, but beneath it a vulnerability had begun to take shape, like cracks in granite that dared to let in the light. She didn't sit. "Before we begin today's proceedings," she said, her voice steady but subdued, "I need to speak not as a judge, but as a citizen, one who made a grave error." The courtroom quieted into a stillness that felt almost sacred. She paused, glanced down at the notes she'd prepared, then set them aside. This wasn't something she could read. It had to come from the marrow. "2 days ago, I sentenced a man named Daniel Cross to 30 days in jail for failing to appear in court. At the time, I saw only what was on the surface. A missed date, a man out of order, a disruption. But I was wrong. Deeply wrong." Her words carried a quiet force, like the kind that could only come from someone used to being obeyed, but now asking, pleading, to be heard. She went on. She spoke of his service, his 2 tours, the Bronze Star, the roadside bomb, the brain injury, the trauma. She described in exacting detail the systemic failures he'd endured, the denied applications, the lost emails, the hearing he missed because of the sentence she had imposed. Her voice broke, just once, on the words, "That failure is on me." And still the courtroom remained silent, not out of coldness, but reverence. Something sacred had unfolded in the space between judge and public. It wasn't just an apology, it was a reckoning. Then, from the back of the room, a single clap. It echoed, sharp and defiant, from a man in fatigues with silver at his temples and medals pinned to his chest. A second clap joined, then a third, and suddenly the chamber thundered, not with outrage, but with understanding, with gratitude. It was applause not for perfection, but for the rare courage it takes to own a mistake in public. From a bench of power, when the room settled, Judge Harlan nodded once and resumed. "I am vacating Mr. Cross's contempt charge and erasing the associated fine, effective immediately." A pause. "But that is not enough. One act of justice does not erase an architecture of failure." She announced the creation of the Cross Initiative, a new program embedded within the local court system that would fast-track veterans into coordinated legal and housing services. Every judge, every clerk, every social worker attached to the docket would receive specialized training on veterans affairs. A dedicated caseworker would be assigned to each applicant. No more circular denials, no more missed hearings due to technicalities. Not under her watch. And then, in a move that made the courtroom stir once again, she said, "I have personally arranged a meeting between Mr. Cross and the VA's housing liaison. The meeting will occur as soon as he is released, which, pending paperwork, should be within 48 hours." That evening, the press conference was held on the courthouse steps. She didn't speak long, only enough to explain the initiative and make it clear this was not about optics. It was about people. It was about names. It was about Daniel. 2 days later, just after noon, Daniel Cross stepped through the steel doors of Hamilton County Jail. He squinted against the sunlight, his shoulders hunched reflexively, like someone bracing for a blow. But instead of a guard or a social worker, it was Judge Harlan who waited by the curb. No robe, no bailiff, just a woman in a dark coat holding a folder and a paper coffee cup. "I can't undo what happened," she said, stepping forward. "But I can help change what comes next." He studied her for a long moment. His eyes, no longer empty, searched her face like it held a question he couldn't quite form. Then, barely, but unmistakably, "Ma..." He nodded, and in that small, silent gesture, something shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet, but maybe the beginning of its possibility.